Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to our webinar, Building Blocks for Private and Hybrid Clouds. Today's webinar focuses on the key considerations for building private and hybrid clouds, and we are joined by two RightScalers who know this topic best. But before we get started, I have a few questions that I would like to ask you. So let's go ahead and launch our first poll. Are you using a private cloud today? So just select the one that's the best option. Yes, with one or more projects in production. Yes, you're using the private cloud and you have at least one project that's growing. Yes, you're starting to explore, or no, you're not using the private cloud. So we'll leave this open for a few more seconds. And we'll push the results out so that you can see how your fellow attendees responded. Okay, the results are out. Well, it looks like a good percentage of you are using a private cloud today, 25%. And some of you, another about 35% are starting to explore, maybe have a simple project that's running. And 40% are not. Good to know. Thank you so much. Next question. So if you are using private cloud or if you're investigating private cloud, which private cloud technologies have you been exploring? So Citrix Cloud Stack, Eucalyptus, OpenStack, a different private cloud technology, or none, and you simply haven't started exploring yet. So again, select all that apply. And this helps us understand and maybe better tailor our presentation for you today. If someone says, if someone chooses one a little bit higher than another, then we might spend a little bit more time talking about that. Just a couple more seconds. Looks like an interesting split here. Majority of folks focusing on OpenStack and then an even split between CloudStack and Eucalyptus. I'm really interested to hear about the others. So if you have a moment and want to enter that into the chat panel, maybe share with us what other private cloud technologies you've been looking at. So thanks for that. Final question, I promise. What's your role? So just select the one that best applies, application developer, sysadmin, architect, or team lead business manager. This is an easy one. All right, pushing that out. Okay, interesting. A lot of architects in the audience. That's great because I have a couple architects behind me right now who will be talking with you guys in a minute. Good split. Cool. Thank you so much. So with that, I'll get started with the webinar. Let me click through. So I'd like to introduce our speakers today. On my right, I have Brian Adler, RightScale's Senior Professional Services Architect. A little background on Brian, he works with our customers from the smallest startups to the largest enterprises and helps them bring their legacy or their new applications to any cloud or combo of clouds that is supported by RightScale. So that would include public clouds, private, or hybrid. He's been exposed to a variety of use cases and application scenarios, and he's a really great resource for our customers. On my left, I have Ryan Geyer. He's RightScale's sales engineer. He works with customers in the pre-sales stages to help them evaluate their workloads, decide where to put them, and to figure out which cloud's the best fit. And I also wanted to let you know that Ryan's built a private cloud in his garage a few months ago. It's kind of awesome and the subject of a blog article if you want to check out blog.rightscale.com. And he'll be sharing some of the details of that later on in the presentation. And then finally, one of the cool things about GoToWebinar is the question panel. And you have, through this webinar, access to some of the smartest people at RightScale. So at any point, if you have any questions about the presentation or about private or hybrid clouds, go ahead and ask your question in the GoToWebinar question pane. Noel Cohen is standing by, and he'll address those questions via text responses as they come in. But some of the ones that are more broadly applicable to the general audience will be answered live on the air by Brian or Ryan. So at any point, feel free to ask your questions. So at this point, I'd like to hand it off to Brian. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And as Sarah mentioned, I'm an architect in our PS group, and so I do end up talking to lots of our customers, and over the last, say, 8-10 months or so, it's become much more common for us to talk to folks about private and or hybrid environments as opposed to just a strict public cloud. So what we're going to spend some time today is kind of talking through what we have seen over the last few years as far as that's concerned in regards to private and hybrid clouds. First thing I'd like to run through is the agenda, and just real quickly run through this. The first thing I always like to do in any webinar or conference presentation is do some definitions and terminology just to make sure that we're all on the same page using the same words for the same things. We'll go through infrastructure evolution real quick, sort of where we started back in the day and where we are today. We'll then delve into some of the private cloud stuff. We'll talk about some key considerations and things you want to keep in mind as you're thinking about building out your private cloud. And then we'll talk about hybrid clouds. I always call these out a little differently and special use case for it because they mean different things to different people, and I want to make sure that we talk about that. And there's oftentimes some considerations that come into play that people don't always take into consideration. We'll then talk about some use cases. We have 3 use cases we're going to talk about today for private and hybrid clouds, and Ryan has a demo around one of them. And then we'll delve into some best practices for the design and implementation of the hybrid cloud, from just the overall design, then talk about hardware and software and how you're going to implement it, how you're going to manage it, etc. And at the end, we'll have some conclusion and Q&A. And as Sarah mentioned, feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation. And Ryan and I will try to answer the ones that we can throughout the hour. And then obviously at the end of the hour, we'll have some time to answer the bulk of the questions that have come in. So with that said, I'd like to quickly get into the definitions and terminology. The first one you're probably all pretty familiar with, virtualization at the server level at least, right? A division of one physical server into multiple isolated virtual environments or VMs, right? So basically the concept of multiple VMs running in the footprint of a single physical node. Private cloud, collection, as you read here, collection of compute storage and network resources for a single tenant. That's the key aspect of the private cloud. It's your stuff. It's you're the only tenant in that private cloud, and you're accessing those resources programmatically via an API or an application programming interface endpoint. A public cloud, very similar, and just the concept here is that it's a multi-tenant environment, right, like AWS or Rackspace or Software or whoever it may be, and that you're, again, accessing those resources programmatically via that API endpoint. And then these last 2 ones might be different from what you have read or have heard or feel might be accurate, but just for the purposes of our discussion, what we talk about as far as a multi-cloud and hybrid cloud and what we'll be using those for the rest of this hour is a multi-cloud is an environment that spans 2 or more separate clouds. They could both be public, they could both be private, you could have 1 or more of each, etc. That's multi-cloud. And a hybrid cloud is a special case of a multi-cloud. And that's an environment that spans 1 or more public clouds as well as 1 or more private clouds. It's obviously most common to have 1 of each, but that's sort of our classic definition of hybrid cloud. Okay, so with that said, let's talk a little bit about infrastructure evolution, sort of where we are now and how that lends itself nicely to going ahead and setting up a private and hybrid cloud. Back in the day, right, we had the old school data centers, and you had racks and racks of physical nodes in some, very expensive to run data center somewhere. You were running 1 application per node, and it's all we knew, right? We didn't know any better, so it was fine. It did what it needed to do. Over time, the capability of a node outgrew the needs of any single app. There's very few applications here that can consume all the resources of some of that high-end specialized hardware, right? So what you ended out is a case where you have lots and lots of idle resources. You might have 10 to 20% utilization of the CPU, which is a huge waste of the power of that particular node. So virtualization came along and it provided the ability to have a many-to-one from a servers to node relationship. You could have many VMs running in that same physical node. And this was a lot better. We got a lot better bang for a buck as a result. And now where we are today, cloudification, right? Virtualization has grown up, and what we now have is an automated provisioning and management facility through an API. And this is much, much better. There's not as much human interaction. You don't have to file tickets with your sysadmin group and your network group and your compute group and your storage group and all that stuff. Things are accessed via this API, which makes it much easier for your end users. Okay, a couple of private cloud key considerations that we always talk to our customers about. The first one, first and foremost, is the workload and infrastructure interaction. And what I mean by here is that applications have different resource needs, right? You might have an application that's really CPU intensive. You might have one that needs lots and lots of IOPS to a disk, right? You want to try to choose the right fit for your application and your infrastructure, right? If you have a super high CPU intensive application and you have some low-end commodity hardware, well, it's probably going to work, but it's not going to be the most efficient use of that hardware, and it's probably a better way to do it. So if at all possible, try to find the right fit, right? Again, always the right tool for the job. Look in your toolbox and try to find the right tool to accomplish the job that you're trying to, that you want to accomplish. From a security standpoint, this is usually a good thing, right? Within a private cloud, your data is typically contained within that private cloud, and it can allow for stricter security compliance. As that data never egresses from your controlled environment, you're probably able to adhere to more strict security regulations. Latency. The folks that use your private cloud, the consumers of those private cloud resources, are typically geographically or network-wise at least closer to that private cloud, closer to those resources, and that reduces the latency. And tied directly to that is user experience. If you have reduced latency, generally your end users are going to be happier. It's going to be a much snappier application. And last but not least, of course, is the cost. Operational expenses are generally reduced when you're using a private cloud. However, capital expenses obviously are a different story. If you're using hardware you've already got, you're in a great place. If you've got to buy all the hardware to build out this private cloud environment, well, it's going to take you some time to earn back that expense. Hybrid clouds, and like I said, I like to call this out a little bit differently. We're going to talk about some hybrid cloud examples here, but what happens if your application outgrows the private cloud, right? That's generally a good problem to have. It means that your app is doing well and you've basically gotten to the point where you've consumed all that you have and you need to find some alternatives. A lot of our customers come to us with this idea of cloud bursting. Hey, I want this cloud bursting thing. And what's cloud bursting? Well, the classic sort of definition is when your private cloud or whatever cloud resources are exhausted, a server tier, and it's typically your application server tier, is going to expand into the public cloud to tap into these theoretically infinite resources. And on paper, it sounds great. It makes a lot of sense. But these considerations that I always talk to customers about oftentimes sway them from this, and we'll talk a little about each of them in turn here. The first one is security, right? When you're in your private cloud, that was all the infrastructure that you owned and you maintained, and now when you're in this cloud bursting mode, you're going to have traversal of the public internet. You're going to need to access that public cloud resource. And as such, you got to secure that traffic. You're not in your own little 10.x.x.x world anymore, right? Latency. We talked about that in the previous slide. Generally, the latency is going to be reduced in a private cloud. But if you're now traversing the public internet, you're not in control of the hops as it goes to the wild, wild west of that internet. So you have no idea on the latency concerns. Cost. Bandwidth charges for public internet traversal, right? Typically, ingress into a public cloud is free, but egress is charged at a sliding scale. So if you get into this cloud bursting scenario, you're going to have additional cost. And then lastly, complexity, right? Setting up a secure environment, it's not trivial. You have to set up a VPN or secure endpoints, et cetera, et cetera. So it's doable, and we do have some customers that are doing it. But a lot of folks come to us thinking, hey, this hybrid cloud is what I want. And after we talk to them about it, say, maybe that's not quite what I want, but let's do it a different way instead. And what we see, this different way, is much more common for us to have customers that have multiple clouds in use in that organization and multiple applications, but each application is contained entirely within one cloud, be it private or be it public. And that's generally how they accomplish the hybrid as opposed to some sort of cloud bursting method. This next slide here is just sort of a pictorial representation and illustration of what cloud bursting really means. As you see on the left there, as we talked about, all of your infrastructure is running in that private cloud. And that app server tier, now, hey, I need more app server capacity, so I go ahead and I grab these app server resources out of this other cloud, and that's the bursting concept. We'd like now to go through a few use cases. We're going to go through 3 of them. The first one is a lot of our customers come to us with and set up what we call the self-service IT portal or the IT vending machine. It's generally used for a test or development environment, and it allows users to select one of several pre-configured technology stacks to accomplish, one of the more common uses within their organization. It allows them to work in a siloed environment, meaning that the servers that they're interacting with are their servers and their servers alone. So if they do something silly like accidentally blow away a database or something like that, they've only affected their own environment and not those of their coworkers. So with that, we have a demo on the IT vending machine, so I'm going to hand it over to Ryan so he can run through the demo.
Okay, thank you, Brian. So what we're going to show you real quickly here is something we've shown in a few other demos in the past, and it's our concept of an IT vending machine, or sort of a one-click interface for getting systems up and running. So this really highlights one of the reasons that you might use a private cloud internally, besides potential cost implications and so forth, which we'll talk a little bit more about. It gives you the opportunity to have that same agility that you get with the public cloud, the ability for users to, single click and with an API be able to provision these things, and then even be able to track that usage and be able to charge it back to individual developers and so forth. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and show you sort of what this looks like, and this might be a developer who needs to stand up a particular environment so that they can start developing. They may not need to know the complexities of the environment that they're setting up, but they need to be able to develop in an environment that is a three-tiered application where there's load balancers, an application tier, and a database tier, and be able to make sure that their application works in that sort of environment. So we're going to use the Zen PHP stack as an example here. And this, again, just for the sake of demonstration, ask the user a few questions. What cloud do we want to put it in? This is all the available clouds that are accessible to that user. We're going to pick AWS US East, a code repository, so where the application code, the PHP application code is going to come from. In this case, it's already pre-populated from previous demos. And we can pick just a domain name, fully qualified domain name for it as well. So we'll do something like webinar.rightscale.com for the sake of this demo. And then we can submit this. Now what it's doing in the background is making API calls to the RightScale system in order to create a new deployment, set up those three tiers of servers, and get them launched and communicating with one another. In just a second here, it's actually going to redirect us to the RightScale dashboard and show us that deployment that gets set up. If we had internet connectivity. That's interesting.
The demo gods got us.
Yeah, they did. All right. Well, hopefully the webinar is still going. Maybe we're just having some DNS lookup problems with my.rightscale. At any rate, what that would have shown had it worked and had we not had DNS problems is actually a three-tier environment set up in RightScale dashboard. Load balancers out in front, an application server tier in the middle, and then a master and slave database. So the power there, for the sake of this demonstration, was we're going to show you that you actually get this whole deployment, and we're going to actually show it to you in the dashboard. For a user, for the self-service sort of use case, the actual developer would have clicked on that, and they could have potentially just gotten a URL to that, or been given some other sort of access to it, rather than actually taking them to the complexity of the RightScale dashboard. I'm going to go ahead and get us right back on the correct slide here, and from the current slide, and you can go ahead and talk to us about the other two use cases, Brian. Thanks.
Sure thing. Thanks, Ryan. And while you were doing that, and we're going to take a look into our DNS issues here, and if we can, we'll go ahead and just give you a quick look at the screen at the end of what Ryan was creating there. As he said, it was basically a three-tier architecture with load balancers in front of a tier of app servers and a master-slave MySQL database behind the scenes. And the key thing, again, there is that that's a siloed environment, so that's for Ryan only to use, and if he goes ahead and makes some crazy mistake in there, he's only going to affect himself and not his other coworkers. It also allows you to stand up multiple of those siloed environments side by side so folks can be productive in their own little sandbox. While Ryan was talking, I was taking a look at some of the questions that we have that have popped in. And so let me go ahead and at least answer one or two of these here. The one I was looking at was private cloud, at least according to Jeff Barr, is a contradiction to the pay-as-you-go concept. And what do we say about this? Well, I mean, yes and no. I mean, really what the point is that you've stood up your own resources, and you can go ahead and charge for those resources internally to your organization however you see fit, right? So using, again, the RightScale tools, and Ryan's probably more familiar with these than I am, but as far as some of the enterprise features, you can go ahead and do chargebacks to the different organizations different departments within your overall organization. So it still can be a pay-as-you-go, where and folks that work in larger organizations know that, the right hand has to pay the left hand a lot of times for bookkeeping and accounting purposes and things like that. So you can still set it up as a pay-as-you-go concept. It's just that, you're paying yourself, essentially, or the departments within your organization are paying yourself. The nice thing about this is that you do own the infrastructure and control all that infrastructure as well. And then a similar question says, but with a private cloud, I pay for all the costs. How does that make sense? Well, the exact same answer there, right? Now, you now have complete control of those assets, and you can dole them out to whoever you want within your organization. If you can manage to hopefully keep your private cloud probably fully utilized, overall, an operational expense standpoint, it's going to be cheaper to run that private cloud than it would be to run a similar environment in a public cloud, because you're paying for that in the instance hour basis, you're paying for the bandwidth and the storage allocation as well. Okay, so with that said, we're going to go ahead on to the next, just to kind of talk through some of the next use cases. The next one is what we call scalable applications with uncertain demand. This is where some of our customers have used the public cloud as a proving ground for their new apps. Basically, they go ahead and launch, they have some new application, they want to see if it gains traction with your audience. They go ahead and throw it out there in the public cloud. And what they've seen is that their applications either do well or don't do well, right? And if they don't do well, they allow them to sort of run their course in the public cloud, and then once the usage has fallen to a certain threshold level, they go ahead and end of life them, right? However, if that application was to gain traction, it's going to remain in the public cloud during its growth phase, and at some point it'll reach sort of a steady state, a more predictable workload. And at that point, the application is then transitioned into the private cloud. So that's a good use of, hey, I want to throw everything against the wall and see what sticks. I don't have room for the crazy spikes that it has, but once it's reached its steady state, I do have room and capacity. And at that point, it makes sense to pull it in. And then the last use case we want to talk about, and this is by far the most common one that we see, especially with the recent cloud outages, actually not so recent even, right? Starting back in like April of 2011 was sort of the first big major one, at least at the AWS level. And since then, we've had a lot of customers coming to us looking for DR environments. And this is what we typically recommend is what you'll see here is a warm DR, a warm disaster recovery scenario, where you have your production environment in one cloud and your DR environment is in the second cloud. And what makes this a warm scenario is that in that secondary cloud, you only have your slave database running. You're a replicating slave if you're running, MySQL, for example, or maybe it's one node of a replica set if you're using Mongo or something along those lines. All the other servers, for those who are familiar with the RightScale platform, you can have all your servers in a non-operational state. They're all staged, if you will, and ready to launch. You just got to click a single button and they'll all launch up. They're in a non-operational state, so you're not paying for them. There's no cost associated with that. You're only paying for the slave server and the bandwidth required between the two clouds. If your production environment was to fail, what you would do is you would promote your slave to your master. You'd launch those standby servers in your disaster recovery cloud, and you do some DNS reassignment to point your front ends to your new cloud, and you're up and going in a relatively short order. So this is by far the most common use case that we're seeing folks come to us now, and we have many, many customers that are running some variant of this in a hybrid environment right now. So with that said, we'd like to jump into some considerations, design considerations. At this point, I'm going to hand it back to Ryan to run through some of these, and I'll jump back at the end when we start talking about some of the implementation and management processes.
Thanks, Brian. So some of the design considerations are, So some of the considerations are the location of the physical hardware. So where are you going to put this stuff? When I built the private cloud in my garage, I obviously only had one place to put it, and I didn't want to spend a lot of money. So the hosted or co-location facility wasn't necessarily an option. But those considerations when you're building this for your enterprise or for your corporation, you have to consider things like if you do want it on-premise, do you have the available, ping, power, and pipe, power, cooling, networking, and so forth, in order to be able to stand that up and maintain it and keep your users happy. It might make sense if you don't want to maintain that overhead of actually putting it in your own data center to put it in a hosted or co-location facility. There's caveats and compromises there as well, in that you may not have ready accessibility to the hardware. If you wanted to update it or modify it, you're sort of at the mercy of your hosting or co-location partner in that case. You might also experience increased latency to your end users. So if your end users are on your physical local network and you have your private cloud hosted someplace else, you may not have really great latency because you're going to traverse the public internet or a VPN to get there. There's also security considerations. You're sort of, again, at the mercy of your hosting or co-location facility for physical security around those things. And you have to, in some way, expose it to your end users who may be on your own network. So it means either setting up and maintaining a VPN or allowing your users to access it over the public internet. So just some considerations that you might have there. So Some of the other things to consider is really the overall configuration of your private cloud. So some of the things to consider there are how available do you need that private cloud to be, and also how redundant do you need to be in case of failure. How do you recover from that? So of course the easiest configuration is sort of also the potentially most vulnerable one, which is a single zone, a single region, a single API endpoint that handles everything. It's great. It's really easy to set up, and generally you can have decent availability of that if you maintain the hardware well and you have good uptime for your ping, power, and pipe there. But if you do have an outage, if you have a problem with your API endpoint, it basically makes your entire cloud unavailable to your end users. If it's all located in a single data center, which it would be in this configuration, if you have power issues, you're at the mercy of battery backup and generators. If those fail, then again you have that sort of single point of failure. In an environment where you need more availability, you need to make sure that what you're running on your private cloud is always up, always available. You may consider doing the more complex configuration, which would include having multiple zones or data centers, and even multiple geographically diverse regions, like some of the public cloud providers that we support offer. It would include or entail multiple API endpoints. So for each one of those regions, they would be completely physically and logically separated. They would have different API endpoints that you call, so that if you have a problem with your management layer and that becomes unavailable, you can still make calls to the other region, the other API endpoint that's unaffected. And then, of course, the same sort of situation exists, or the same consideration exists, of really segregating power networking and having redundancy there, maybe multiple internet connections for your data center, so on and so forth, so you even have a high availability of that within an individual data center. And then on this slide, this is sort of a physical, or an image representing those two different options. On the left, we have sort of the simple single endpoint, single set of compute nodes and storage. It's fairly easy to set up, but there's no real high availability or redundancy there. If you have a problem, that's really a single point of failure. And then you can see represented on the right-hand side the additional complexity that's involved in having a really highly available configuration set up with geographically diverse configurations and nodes in different data centers and cloud controllers with different API endpoints. Certainly the value there is the high availability and the fact that you can recover from any one component failing, but it certainly adds complexity. So some additional things to consider when you're assembling your private cloud or considering a private cloud strategy is sort of what the workloads and use cases are. If you can deal with some downtime of the applications or the uses that you're running, maybe those developers are only there during business hours in a particular time zone, and you have a fairly decent SLA with your operations group to be able to get those things back up, it might be acceptable if you have short periods of downtime on your private cloud that might be in a single data center. If it's user-facing and you're actually making revenue with a site or an e-commerce application that's running, you certainly probably don't want to have any sort of downtime there. You want to have that high availability. So that kind of touches on the second bullet there too. Is it flexible enough for the infrastructure to allow you to set up test beds and proof of concepts? Depending on how you set things up, certain hardware options are excluded. So using a specific type of software, which we'll talk about in a second here as well, might limit which pieces of hardware you can use in your data center and in your private cloud implementation. But it might also affect the agility, right? If you're going after that use case of developers being able to create siloed environments, depending on what you select, you might be able to set those environments up more quickly or less quickly. There's also considerations around the sort of performance requirements that your applications and use cases have. Does it require a lot of CPU? Does it require a lot of disk IOP or maybe low latency interconnects within your private cloud. And that might include not only connections between nodes within your private cloud, but connections between your private cloud and maybe some on-premise specialized hardware, or connectivity between your private cloud and your end users. Those are all things to consider when you're building your private cloud strategy. So we'll talk a little bit about the hardware and then the software on the next slide here. These are some of the things that you're going to consider as you're sort of putting together the pieces and deciding what you're going to use to build your private cloud. Are you going to use commodity hardware? If so, the benefits of that are that it's going to make it really easy for you to add capacity or swap out failed components. Things of that nature are going to be very easy to find and replace. Or do you maybe need high-end or specialized hardware? We talked a little bit about needing specialized, IOPS, high IOPS, or high internet connectivity between, or high network connectivity between nodes. That might dictate that you use high-end or specialized hardware, and that's something to consider as you're putting things together. There's downsides to that, compromises as well. You may need it for a specific workload, but it does limit your available options. There's only a handful of manufacturers that maybe provide the exact thing that you need. It's certainly going to cost more because it's specialized, and it could also make things difficult to maintain. If one of those components fail, you have to go back to the manufacturer to get a replacement or get it repaired under warranty, whatever the case may be. So definitely something to consider there of what the exact workload is going to be for your private cloud so you can pick the right compute resources. Similarly with networking, this is often driven by topology, your needs for latency, and then price as well. Traditionally in a lot of private clouds that we see built, and in a lot of the public cloud providers, we see a very flat network topology. It's usually handled security and connectivity is usually handled very simply with either virtual firewalls or very simple firewall configurations between nodes. And then we also consider that, I mentioned this on a previous slide, there's only, in some cases, the software offerings that manage and maintain the private cloud for networking in particular only support certain devices. So CloudStack is a Citrix product. They're going to integrate very well with NetScaler, things of that nature. Something like OpenStack is going to try to have a broader set of hardware that it interacts with and works well with, but may not have specialized access to those things. It may not have as good an integration with a NetScaler, for instance. Other considerations on the storage side, this usually is a fairly simple algorithm. It's a cost versus performance sort of thing. Do you go for just a simple, rack-mounted device that will allow you to do NFS, or maybe you do SSD drives because you need very high disk performance? Maybe you go with that high-priced SAN. It's really a breakdown of cost versus performance in this case.
And Ryan, let me go ahead and interrupt you here real quick just to let you know we're getting a lot of great questions in, and I was going to kind of interrupt you, but I'm looking at them, and a lot of them are related to the hardware and software considerations that you're talking about, and Ryan's just about to jump into the software considerations, so after his next slide, we'll go ahead and knock off a few of these questions. So.
Okay, yeah, thanks for the heads up, Brian. So we'll talk a little bit about software considerations and then answer some of those questions. So once you get your hardware all kind of figured out and you know what you're going to stand up there, then you start to think about the software that you're going to use to manage and maintain that. So first of all, Brian kind of gave us that real great introduction of moving from sort of the old way of doing things with traditional data centers to virtualization and then to cloud. This software layer is really what makes it cloud. It's not just virtualization. So we talk about things that we use here specifically at RightScale, our CloudStack, OpenStack, and Eucalyptus. We have a lot of familiarity with these. The great thing about all of them is that they're all available in an open source flavor. So you can install them, get some experience with them, and start using them. And then when you actually put that into production, you can buy a support contract from the manufacturer, Citrix or OpenStack or Eucalyptus in this case. Again, it can kind of dictate or influence other decisions about your cloud implementation, which hypervisors it supports, which network devices it supports. Those sorts of things are going to be things you're going to want to consider to pick the right one that fits with the hardware and workload needs that you have. And then they often, in the case of all three of the ones that we've mentioned here, have a couple of different ways that you can access those resources and access that particular cloud technology. Usually there's a web interface, varying complexities depending on what you choose. And that's usually used for the folks that are actually maintaining and operating that private cloud. It's going to be to add additional capacity to the private cloud, set up network configuration devices, things of that nature. And then there's the access through the API. And then this is usually what you see folks using, like RightScale, for instance, to automate those private clouds. And you'll also see developers potentially using that API directly to manipulate the private cloud. And then, of course, on top of that, there's yet another layer that adds some value in automation, which is cloud management software. So the value and the things that that brings to the table is abstracting the underlying details of the cloud infrastructure offerings. So you may have a private cloud that you've built with very specific pieces of hardware, has very specific performance characteristics that you need in order to run a certain workload. Or you may have more of a commodity type private cloud, and you want to be able to run that same workload in your private cloud as well as one of the public clouds, sort of that hybrid cloud environment that we talked about. What a cloud management software allows you to do is build out a definition of what that server, what that workload looks like, and be able to operate it in the same way on any of the cloud resource providers that you have. So it could be your private cloud and a public cloud. It could be a mix of public clouds as well. The cloud management software is going to do that by presenting a sort of consistent interface of the available resources, regardless of what the actual infrastructure provider looks like. So really generalizing on things like compute, network, and storage, and giving you a common interface that looks the same regardless of the actual underlying infrastructure. I mentioned this already a little bit, but it provides portability of those workloads, assuming that you're using a commodity-based type of workload that you know can run the same on, similar hardware running in various different places. You have the ability to move that workload around because you've designed it in a way that's detached or not aware necessarily of the specifics of the underlying infrastructure. And then, of course, it adds orchestration tools for managing that. So we talked about setting up a three-tier infrastructure. It gives the ability for the servers in that three-tier architecture to know about one another. The application servers are aware of the load balancers, aware of the database servers, and can connect to them and dynamically create that environment.
So great, thanks, Ryan. So the next slide, we're going to start to talk about some implementation processes and management processes. But in the meantime, I want to pick off a few questions and thank you to the audience for sending these in, by the way. The first one I want to hit here is, it says, from your and the reason like I said, I paused is some of these are very relevant to the topic that Ryan was just discussing. So this one's from a little ways back, but from your definitions of cloud types, what would you call an environment that is a combination of real hardware that potentially uses a cloud environment to scale when resources are exceeded? Well, that would probably still be considered a hybrid, although I don't know if it would be a hybrid cloud at that point, because if I understand the question, you're kind of using real hardware, not cloudified hardware, if you will, and you're trying to go ahead and burst down into the public cloud in order to accomplish that. Now, we have had customers in the past, are not doing it that way anymore, that have done something like this, and what that is involved is leveraging the RightScale API. Instead of doing it all through the RightScale interface, the RightScale dashboard, where you can set this up in a hybrid environment. If you're managing that real physical hardware, they've used the RightScale API to go ahead and burst down on that other cloud. Now, with that said, what they're now migrating to, and we're adding support for as well, is some of the cloud infrastructure providers that Ryan talked about. For example, CloudStack and OpenStack, and I believe Eucalyptus, but I'm not sure. I'd have to check on that one, are beginning to offer support for bare metal provisioning. So basically what that does is allows you to have one VM per node. Well, it's not even fair to call it a VM at that point. One M per node, if you will. There's no hypervisor in the mix. So basically you get the full benefits of that physical node, and you're not traversing two network stacks, for example, every time you send a packet out. It's just that one physical machine. So as we add support for that, you'll then be able to have a hybrid cloud where you're managing your bare metal through the RightScale Dash, as well as you're bursting, or if you want to call it, into that public cloud, again, through the RightScale Dash. So I would call it what you have now, hybrid, not hybrid cloud, but it could always move towards a hybrid cloud if you go ahead and use one of those infrastructure softwares that support that bare metal provisioning. The other question I want to ask you is what support do we have for Red Hat? Well, for RHEL right now, many of our server templates that are supported in AWS currently have RHEL support. We're working on Rackspace. There's a little bit of licensing kind of stuff that we're working through with them. We will have RHEL support for them as well. And we also have RHEL images we've rolled for custom images for customers that we've done in both the Cloud Stack, in just the Cloud Stack Cloud. We did it recently with Cloud Stack 2.2.14. And we're currently rolling one for the 3.0.4 release. So we do have support for RHEL, and we're adding more support for it in some of the other clouds as we go forward.
And then just to add a little bit of detail to that, so for Red Hat, that's often a popular choice for the host operating system for a hypervisor, something like KVM and so forth. So for us, for RightScale, there isn't really a need to support that per se. You can run whatever operating system you like, and then if it's one of the supported hypervisors for either CloudStack, OpenStack, or Eucalyptus, then that's fine on the host operating system as well. So it's fully supported as a host operating system.
Great, thanks, Ryan. A couple more questions here before we get back to slides. So when you say, and I think this one was probably answered with Ryan's last slide, but we'll just make sure that we delve into it a little bit deeper. But when you say private cloud, does it come down to specific hypervisors that RightScale supports, or do you need orchestration and provisioning tools like Yuka, CloudStack, et cetera? Which ones do you support and which ones do you not? And like I said, hopefully the previous slide showed you that, yes, we ride on top of that cloud infrastructure software, or that orchestration software, as the audience member put it, and we do support Eucalyptus, OpenStack, and CloudStack currently. So, and any of those hypervisors. So we allow you to abstract, and actually I'm going to get into the stealing my own thunder here in a second, but the following slide is going to talk about how we can abstract you from that lock-in at all those levels. So you can go ahead and use any of those cloud infrastructure providers and any of the hypervisors that you want, and RightScale can kind of ride on top of all of that. And then the last question here I wanted to ask before I jump back was, it says, what are the best practices for network configuration and security when you want to deploy in public cloud and want to connect your internal machines easily to public cloud? Does it require manual config for networking? Any suggestions there? So that's not necessarily a true hybrid cloud environment. Again, it sounds like you're tying it back to your on-premise physical nodes, but there are a lot of options that exist there. For those who are familiar with the Amazon VPC, their virtual private cloud, that's a very good use case for doing that. They have a configuration set up so you can set up your own virtual network there, your own network segmentation, if you will, and all those cloud-based instances are part of your virtual private cloud, part of your own network. There are also other tools that you can use to create VPNs. So, for example, OpenVPN is an open source tool that you can use to go ahead and create that VPN tunnel between the cloud-based instances and your own instances and your own physical nodes. There's also one called, they changed the name, so I apologize, I have the old name in my head, but Cohesive FT is the company, and it was called VPN Cube. They've rebranded it. I don't know what it's called. It's still the same thing, basically, and that allows you also to set up a virtual network, if you will. And then lastly, for some sort of point-to-point type stuff, for example, that slave database that we showed when we had the warm DR scenario, if you have a point-to-point need, like in that example, you can go ahead and use one of our partners, Cloud Optimizer, and the product is called Cloud Opt, and that basically allows you to create a secure endpoint between any two instances, regardless of where they're located, cloud or on-premise. So there's a lot of different options there that exist for you.
So there's one other quick question, which is how can we see more about the RightScale vending? I apologize for the difficulty we have there. I think at the end of the webinar we might roll the dice and give that one more try. But in case that doesn't answer the questions that you have, or if you want to see it, then go ahead and get in contact with our sales team. There'll be some information on that on the last slide, and we'll get you some more information about that way.
Yeah, and Ryan can do a personalized go-to-meeting session or a go-to-webinar session for you, and hopefully that will have internet connectivity when he does that. So, all right, so back to the slides. Oh, okay, sorry, I already flipped through. There it is. So implementation process. When it comes time to, rubber to the road, when it comes time to really set this up, hardware, first and foremost, are you going to use what you got, or are you going to get new stuff, right? Pre-existing has a huge benefit, which is it's cheap, right? You already got it. However, it may limit your ability to tailor your workload to that infrastructure. We talked about before, if you have very specific workload needs, high CPU is the example that I've given, and you have low-end commodity hardware, it might not be a good fit, right? So it might limit your ability to really tailor it towards workloads that you have going forward. The cloud infrastructure software that Ryan talked about. This decision is going to dictate and or limit a lot of future decisions potentially. So for example, if you have a NetScaler and you want to integrate with that, well, CloudStack's a great way to go, right? They're both owned by Citrix now, and they've obviously tied integration in very nicely. If you go with one of the other vendors, OpenStack or Eucalyptus, they probably aren't going to have that level of support, if at all. So just think about those things, right? You research your options and choose wisely is what we say here. There's a lot of tools out there. You can probably find the right fit, but make sure that you've kind of considered all the intricacies of your particular workload and your particular environment that you have from a physical standpoint as well. Then the cloud topology, and Ryan talked a little bit about this as well, but are you going to have more than one zone? Hopefully you will. Are you going to have more than one region? Not many of our customers do. Actually, only one of them I can think of. That's very, very uncommon. But if you have a big enough environment and your needs are great enough, maybe it makes sense. How are you going to deal with your storage allocation? How are you going to set up your high availability, right? Are you going to spread it across those zones? Are you going to have load balancers in front? Are you going to have redundancy, et cetera? So you need to think how you want to set out your cloud from a topological standpoint. And then lastly, build or buy. You're going to do this yourself, or you're going to have someone do it for you. If you've got that in-house expertise, that's probably the best way to go. They're most familiar with your setup. However, there's lots and lots of vendors out there that will support all of the different offerings, right? And there's lots of them that are popping up in the OpenStack world right now as well. They'll build using your existing resources. They'll basically parachute in and, hey, what do you got? And we'll go ahead and set you up. And then other vendors will bring in pre-configured hardware, basically racks of hardware that they drop in. They hook up networking, they hook up power, they power it on, and you're good to go. So lots of different options out there. So take a look. If you're not interested in building yourself, take a look. There's a lot of companies out there that can assist. And not to give RightScale plugs, but obviously we have a lot of partners that can help here as well. So if you're lost as to where to start, reach out to RightScale. We can kind of point you in the right direction as well. And then sort of the last one before we get into the conclusion in the kind of Q&A session as well is the management process. And obviously this is where, we're tainted with the RightScale rose-colored glasses here, but the concepts are all the same regardless of how you want to manage that cloud, right? You want to have compatibility. I've talked about this previously in one of the questions that we answered, but you want to avoid vendor lock-in, right, at both the infrastructure provider level, the hypervisor level, and the cloud infrastructure software level. You want to be able to pack up your stuff and move if somebody, if you're not happy for whatever reason, right? You want to have unified control and security. We talk about the single pane of glass to allow users access to the system and all the resources under there. It allows you to manage keys and credentials in a single place, those kinds of things. Obviously, one of the big things is the on-demand self-service provisioning, which if the IT vending machine had worked, you would have seen in action. But basically allows your end users access to resources without administrative intervention. You don't have to file a ticket that goes to the network guys, the compute guys, the storage guys, and gets lost because Joe's on vacation, that kind of stuff, right? You can go ahead and give users access to stuff right now on their own. And lastly, the management platform allows you to focus on what you're good at, right? Your core competency is probably not image management and provisioning and automation tools and all that. You're probably good at developing apps, and that's what you want to keep your focus on, right? You don't want to get distracted and have to put a lot of manpower and costs into things that aren't part of your business. They're just to keep your business running, right? So with that said, I just kind of want to quickly run through some summary and conclusions here, and then maybe we can see if we have a few extra questions as well. Back in the day, private and therefore hybrid as a result, the clouds were originally thought of as an academic exercise or science project, right? Some of these really started in both the educational and then the sort of the government and scientific communities, right? But recent advances, particularly in the cloud infrastructure software, that's really where things have driven the most in the last couple of years, has really shown that private and hybrid clouds are viable for IT delivery. You can run production workloads on these private and hybrid clouds, and lots of our customers are doing this. However, a lot of considerations come into play. You have to think about the overall design. You have to think about the hardware you're going to use, where you're going to get it, the software that you're going to use, the infrastructure software management layer, all that kind of stuff. And then the implementation details, right? The devil's always in the details. So the point is, and with many technology discussions, is that no one size fits all. There's a lot of tools out there. Kind of do your research, and almost certainly you're going to find a tool in the toolbox that's going to do what you want. But make sure you go digging for it because it might not be obvious at first blush. So with that said, that's sort of all the prepared comments that we've got. I'll see if we got any more questions that we've got here. Let me go ahead and refresh our question page. I don't know if Ryan, if you picked up one yet.
No, it looks like we've actually answered most of what's come in. I'm gonna roll the dice and actually try this one more time.
I'll let Ryan do that while I see what other questions we've got here, folks.
Okay, so that works. We'll show you sort of the whole end to end here. So just to kind of reset on what we're going to show here, the concept here is sort of that self-service use case. So we talked a couple of times about a developer, being able to go to an interface, a RightScale vending machine in this case, that is going to let them get a pre-built infrastructure. And these pre-built infrastructures might be defined by your IT or operations group as sort of pre-built things that developers can really easily set up and then do their work inside of those environments. So the idea is you'll be able to click on this and be able to choose some of the details about what you're going to load. In this case, it's a fairly simple set of options. Which cloud you want to launch it in. It could just as easily be pre-selected for your developer based on the group that they're in, or maybe the cost center that they're under. It might go to a specific private cloud or something of that nature. The code repository, which is pre-selected here, but where the actual source code is going to come from for this particular application. And a domain name, we're going to do webinar.rightscale.com, and then click submit. And what's happening on the back end here is API calls are being made to RightScale to help kind of abstract the complexity of the different cloud options that you may have chosen there, as well as to get these virtual machines configured and up and running as the actual roles that they're going to fulfill. So in this case, we chose that Zend PHP 3-tier stack. So this is a full stack of servers with load balancers that are out in front of the application servers, a pair of application servers in this case that are up and configured and have deployed the application code that you specified from filling out that detail on the vending machine, and then a master and slave pair of databases. And this is all set up for you just kind of by clicking on that button and using the RightScale API to automate that. So again, developer can go in and get this and start working, and whatever they do, to Brian's point, if something goes horribly wrong in this deployment, it's isolated to that one developer. So did we get any new questions?
We sure did. We sure did. So so let me see here. I've got a couple. So it says, well, this one is sort of unrelated, but I'll make a comment on it anyway. Unrelated to our topic, I should say. Can you comment on security with respect to the recent high-profile attack that took place and involved Apple and a certain IT commentator? For those of you that aren't familiar, I forget the guy's name, but he worked for Wired magazine, and he had basically his digital life erased by a couple hackers who did some kind of interesting hacking, to be honest with you. I don't ever like to give those guys props, but it was interesting how they had done it. But basically the point there is that wasn't anything to do with the cloud per se. That had to do with certain vendors and their what's the word I'm looking for there, customer service management processes, if you will. But sort of the one takeaway that I think that I would give folks here, and I think the author mentioned it as well, is use two-factor authentication, right? If you have just a password, you're pretty vulnerable to stuff. So use two-factor authentication wherever you can. That's sort of the only comment that I make there. The next question I have here is an interesting one, considering we just had an announcement about something related to this recently, but we're not quite there yet. But it says, do you have any ROI TCO calculators for cost analysis between full public to hybrid private public available? And we recently acquired a company called Shop for Cloud. Okay, Shop for Cloud, which has been rebranded Plan for Cloud. And what they allow you to do is basically do a cost analysis between different public cloud vendors. So, for example, you can go ahead and create what you think your deployment is going to look like and run it through an AWS model, a Rackspace model, an Azure model, and a Google Compute Engine model. And we just finished that acquisition recently, just last month. We have big plans for that tool, and we plan on going ahead and setting up, adding additional clouds, and hopefully, I don't know this for a fact, but I'd be surprised if we weren't going to add the public clouds there as well. So hopefully that answers that question. Let's see, another question here is,
I think this is a great one for you, Brian. I know we've got a white paper about building private clouds, so this is kind of a little bit deeper dive into that technology. The question is, this is sort of a high-level presentation. I was wondering if you have the following for a deeper dive. Scholarly papers, articles on how your cloud can provide on-demand elasticity based on self-service monitoring data, and how the system can preempt hardware software requirements. So We have some, I think, white papers that would fit into some of those.
Yeah, we have, and Sarah, I need you to know, I'm going to look over my shoulder here. Sarah, where is that on RightScale.com/whitepapers?
Yeah,
Sorry.
if you go to rightscale.com/whitepapers, look for designing, forget the exact title, designing private and hybrid clouds.
I wrote it and I don't remember the title, but if you go to rightscale.com/whitepapers, you'll see the list of everything that we've got there. We've got stuff on load balancing, we've got stuff on scalable architectures, we've got stuff on the private and hybrid clouds as well. So yes, Ryan, thank you. And I apologize, I can't remember the title of the paper that I wrote. So
it's just designing private and hybrid clouds.
there you go, designing private and hybrid clouds. All right. So another question that came in as well, and this is sort of not necessarily again on this topic, but related to what you can do through RightScale. It says, I'm also interested in application support for developers being able to upload new code and patches to the cloud environment. Using the RightScale platform, for those who aren't familiar, we have the concept of running an operational script on a server or servers. So if I understand this question correctly, the common use case that we have is that, hey, I've got my infrastructure up and running, everything's great, I'm on version 1.0 and my developers just came out with a version 2.0, and I've got 50 application servers in an array out there, and how am I going to go ahead and update these, right, in an efficient manner without any downtime or minimal downtime? The RightScale management platform gives you the tool to run an operation script on a server or an array of servers at one time. So we have a script and or a chef recipe that will do a code checkout from an SVN repo, a Git repo, or what we call ROS, Remote Object Storage. That basically means like S3 if you're in AWS, or Cloud Files if you're in Rackspace, or Swift, is that what it is? Thank you. I'm getting my nomenclature mixed up. Swift if you're running an OpenStack, etc. You can go ahead and you can run that script, on that operational script. It'll go ahead and pull down that new version of code, and it's input driven. So you say, hey, I want to go to this SVN repo, I want to use this tag, I want to pull down this version and lay it down on all my servers. So the RightScale platform provides that ability to you. So I'm looking through here. Another question is about common security considerations when designing a cloud solution, and a lot of this kind of ties into what I talked about before around when I answered the question with the VPC as an option, OpenVPN, VPN Cubed, Cloud Opt, and the Cloud Optimizer product. So I would say if you're interested in sort of that back, exposed front end and secure back end type of security scenario, you look at one of those options as well. How to meet, here's a question, make sure I'm reading it right, I apologize. How to meet the staff's computing need when the network is down and you cannot access the private cloud? Well, that's kind of what Ryan talked about when he's talked about the single point of failure and setting up your HA configuration, is that what you want to do is you want to make sure if the SLA to your end user is important to you, you need to make sure that you have some sort of HA in place. And if you do have power outages or something along those lines, you do have another infrastructure, part of your infrastructure running somewhere else that's on a different grid or on a different UPS or whatever it might take to keep you up and running. So, Ryan, did you have, sorry, I'm still just kind of reading through. Have you seen any other interesting ones that you want to pull out?
Nothing in particular. There's this one that is highlighted right now. What are sort of the features and criteria needs to consider while choosing the cloud management software? So some of the things to consider when you're looking at that sort of third layer of abstraction.
Sure, absolutely, absolutely. So that's sort of the, like we talked about, the three right now, at least that we're supporting, is OpenStack, CloudStack, and Eucalyptus. Touched a little bit on that, but for one of the examples that I gave is hardware, physical network device support, right? So obviously Citrix owns both CloudStack and obviously NetScaler. So if you want to go ahead and integrate with an on-premise device that you have, maybe it makes sense to go with them. Eucalyptus has its own, in Eucalyptus 3.0, they now have their more full-featured HA scenario, so it might make sense to take a look at that. OpenStack is evolving. There's a lot of folks involved in that project, and they're adding a lot of cool features, particularly around Keystone, and then also I think it's called Quantum, which is their new network management feature. So if you want to take a look at that, it really boils down to what is important for your particular environment. If you need network segmentation, then maybe it makes sense to look at OpenStack. If you want to have integration with on-premise hardware, maybe it makes sense to look at CloudStack, etc. And then as far as the RightScale piece of that is concerned, we're kind of agnostic, right? And if you can go ahead and get your cloud stood up on one of those three providers, you can register with RightScale. We can go ahead and manage those resources for you. So
there's another question, so specifics on your opinion about what should or should not be maintained in the cloud would be appreciated. So Without getting into too much detail about it here, there's actually a blog article that I wrote that was from actually another webinar that we did called Identifying Workloads for the Cloud that kind of goes over some of the considerations of what workloads are a good fit for a public or private cloud, and which ones just maybe belong still in the data center or in a virtualization environment. So go ahead and check that out, blog.rightscale.com. The name of the blog post is Identifying Workloads for the Cloud.
Great, thanks, Ryan. And then one other question here, I just want to make sure, and this might just be either me misunderstanding or the asker of the question misunderstanding the way that RightScale works, but are there plans for entering the China market? Well, as far as RightScale is concerned, right, we're a SaaS solution and we're everywhere, right? So as far as that's concerned, as far as the public clouds entering the China market, that's a question to be asked of Rackspace, AWS, et cetera. If you're looking at standing up a public cloud, and some of our customers do right now, we have a very big customer that, a name you all have heard of, that are running multiple private clouds in China, and those are all managed through the RightScale interface. We've had a little bit of issues with firewalls and stuff like that to get access to them, but we've got them up and running cleanly now as well. So as far as setting up a private cloud in China, you can do it today, and RightScale can help you manage it.
So there's another question about how we manage software and security patches for software vendors. So there's a couple of different approaches there. The key one that we implement with the server templates that we produce from RightScale, there's a number of server templates for 3-tier stacks, load balancers. In the application tier, it's PHP, Java, Rails, and IIS. And then in the database tier, it's MySQL, Microsoft SQL 2003, 2005, and we're working on some NoSQL stuff as well. That's sort of the core set that we maintain. For those, we have a release cycle that's approximately every 6 weeks, and those include new images that are the latest operating systems and the latest patches for those operating systems. Typically, that's up to date enough for most folks, and you can roll out new deployments with the newer images and keep up to date that way. If you need to do hot patches of certain things, maybe you've got a hot patch of Apache that's for a specific security vulnerability, what we offer is the ability to run scripts operationally on any one of the servers that you're running that are under RightScale management that allows you to update those things on an ad hoc basis. So we've had situations where we've had to roll out hotfixes for Apache for a security vulnerability that was discovered, and it's as simple as executing a single script on all of your servers that are running Apache. So that's a couple of different approaches that we have to that.
Hey guys, I just wanted to jump in real quick and acknowledge that we're a little bit after the hour. So to the audience, we have 2 more questions that we'd like to address. Thanks again for this high volume. It seems like you're all really interested in this topic. So we're going to let Brian and Ryan go ahead and answer these, and then we'll wrap it up. So we've just got a couple more minutes. Thank you.
Cool, thanks, Sarah. And actually, these might be relatively quick questions now that I look at them. But first one is, can customers of RightScale take advantage of reserved instances? And for those in the audience that aren't familiar, they're talking about, in particular, Amazon's concept of reserved instances, where you can go ahead and basically prepay for an instance type, and if you use it for you can reserve it for 1 year or 3 years, and it works out that if you have it more than 40% utilized for a year and more than 30% utilized over those 3 years, it actually comes out at saving you some significant dollars. So the answer is yes, you can take advantage of that, and that's actually just a function of launching an instance in the correct zone and the correct region, the correct zone of the correct size. So when you go ahead and through RightScale, you configure how you want to launch your servers. You choose the size, the region, and the zone that matches what you've previously purchased or reserved instances with Amazon. And when you launch those instances, they will automatically take advantage of the reserved instance if you have capacity left in your account, or whatever the correct phrase is for that. And then the second question, I think, is for Ryan, if I understand it right. It says, did you just roll out all that infrastructure or parts of it? And I think they're talking about your IT vending machine, so I'm going to go ahead and take that one.
Yep. So the goal of that thing is to actually roll out the entire infrastructure, and that's sort of the power of that, is that a developer may need to design and work in an environment that is distributed like that, where app servers are behind load balancers and deal with the complexities of session stickiness and those sorts of things to make sure that their application works in that environment. So the IT vending machine is designed to actually roll out that full 3-tier architecture and actually set up all the configuration whereby app servers are behind load balancers. They're connected to a master and slave database. We talked about the use case of doing that for dev and test, which is certainly a legitimate use case, but this could also be for perhaps less technical groups within your organization that do need to produce and implement and run production environments. If you've designed that IT vending machine and those deployments and server templates in such a way that they can accept inputs and configuration from an IT vending machine, something like that, you can actually have those folks say, I want to run a PHP application or a Ruby on Rails application, and I know where the application code is for it, and they can do a single button click and actually have a fully scalable environment set up for them as well, which is what we've demonstrated in the past with that.
Cool. Thanks very much, Ryan. So I think Sarah did such an excellent job of leading us in. I think I'll go ahead and let her lead us out. And just from Ryan and I's standpoint, just want to say thanks very much for your time. And Sarah?
Cool. Thanks, Brian. And yeah, thanks everyone for joining us today. Brian and Ryan mentioned a lot of resources on our website that I think are good next steps for you to follow up on. If you want to just head on over to rightscale.com/whitepapers, you can check out the Designing Private and Hybrid Cloud white paper that Brian actually wrote and referenced earlier. Also, rightscale.com/webinars. We have the archive for the Identifying Workloads to Move to the Cloud webinar that Ryan referenced. So those are all good resources for you. Thanks again for joining us. This webinar has been recorded. We'll be sending out a link to this later tomorrow if you'd like to relive the experience or share it with your friends. Thanks again for joining us. Have a great day.